Welcome, History 102 class. We're doing with World War II. What we're doing here is I want to start off with the argumentative assignment. Notice what we're doing in it is we're tying it to the theme of just war doctrine that comes from arguably the Catholic Church, Augustine of Hippo. It was somewhat systematized and secularized by Hugo Grotius, a Dutch humanist in the 1600s, I believe it was, and gave notions in two broad categories. Basically, especially in early Europe, for Catholic Christian Europeans, the reasons for which you fight and the manner by which you fight have to hit certain criteria, and if such, you need not fear of facing judgment for the sin of murder, killing in the event of killing someone on the battlefield. That you could be excused for your violent acts on the battlefield, right? If it is considered a quote just war. All right. So, I mean, this is much more enjoyable in class when we're able to have dialogue on this topic. But I just wanted to throw that out there. So with number one, right, look for good old court history, whereby I try to convey the fascist countries, right, particularly Nazi Germany, as inherently dangerous, right, inimical to everything that Western civilization does and ought to hold dearly, like individual freedom, individual autonomy, basic human rights, checks and balances, freedom against and protection against tyranny and arbitrary power. Just the list goes on and on. Enumerated constitutionally restrictive powers, etc. Fascism was dangerous to all of that, right? Fascism, you look at so many components to it. It adhered oftentimes to kind of the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche, to kind of expedite and go along with social Darwinism and the laws of survival of the fittest, etc. And they called for sometimes they excused violent, just violent solutions to problems, right? And of course, to them, they perceived lack of unity as a problem. And remember, in parliamentary systems in the 1920s, Weimar Germany and France, etc., inefficiency is not necessarily a bad thing. It helps, keep away, tyrannical behavior from a single faction or a single political leader, etc., right? And so, completely different value system. They wanted, force. They wanted unity. And with that unity, right, we're not talking about kind of Rousseau's, will of the majority, his kind of vague notion of that, because it wasn't simply majoritarian, or you have a referendum or vote on issues and let the majority go. But whatever the general will is, right, was to be decided in fascism by a single leader, by the Führer, right, the leader, or Duce. And that leader, almost supposedly, there was this blind trust in his mystical ability to divine what the general will is and ought to be, right? And there was not a system of checks and balances against the dictator, right? There was an intolerance of multi-party system and oppositional parties. There was an intolerance of a free press and opposition via, the written, printed, or spoken word. They did not want, free debate and dialogue and cooperative governing to transpire. That was nowhere near on the list of priorities under fascism. Remember, the fasces, right, are the bundle of straw that's bound together, signifying that each single piece of that straw, while easily broken, when you bundle them together, you cannot, right? And so that every person, right? Kind of like with functional theory and sociology, every person is just a single part, a single cog in the big wheel. So it does not support individualism, right? Or classical liberalism, right? Like John Stuart Mill, the individual is autonomous to do whatever he or she wants. Fascism was not cool with that. Fascism was for what's best for the community, as decided upon one single party led by one single leader, right? Fascism just happened to be, I don't know if it was inherent in their ideology, but pretty much without exception, the fascist countries were imperialistic. They early on advocated taking over foreign lands, right? And just coercively conquering foreign lands. With the Nazi Germany, right? They used the term Lebensraum, right? Like living space for their Germanic Teutonic people and population, right? But as far as the restrictiveness of the fascism, right, is of course with Nazi Germany, they took it to a higher level with their notion of the people's community, right? The Volksgemeinschaft. If you did not meet the requirements, right, those nebulous requirements. Well, I say nebulous because they got it down to like 1/8 Jewish could prohibit you from entry, right, and acceptance. They had some finite criteria, but still, I mean, give me a break. Just pure German, Teutonic, Aryan. We don't have time to get into all that stuff with the Aryans taking over the Dravidians of India, supposedly, imposing a monolithic culture so many years past. At any rate, but it does actually employ like the swastika, etc. But their notion, right, that you had to be in this elite group. So if you were an undesirable, right, if you were a oh gosh, it was something mentioned, a subhuman, if you will, right, an undesirable, that oftentimes could eventually get you into a victim status of the Holocaust. It supposedly happened organically. Supposedly it began, with the Nuremberg laws, where they would simply disenfranchise the Jewish Germans and other undesirables. You had those who were commonly arrested as criminals, systematically or quite for a long period of time, homeless, or mentally or psychologically impaired. They eventually decided that all Slavic peoples were subhuman and could not, attain entry into the Volksgemeinschaft. The homosexuals, communists, and other dissidents. It was largely also coincided with a quasi-civil war with the left on the streets and in Weimar Parliament in Germany before 1933, when Hitler became chancellor. Supposedly it evolved organically, but supposedly, right, there was the term literally final solution that was eventually brought forth by either Heydrich or Heinrich Himmler, stating, right, that ultimately they were not just going to put them in, quote, labor camps, but what we know today as execution or concentration camps, right? Infamous ones like Auschwitz and Dachau and others. So at any rate, we know that, from hindsight, they're going to systematically murder 12 million people. And as they go into lands, right, where they have decided that they are not to be gained entry into their people's community, they, at the very least, search out non-desirables to have them sent to the concentration camps, or even worse, and even more, systematically, thorough than that, is like with their infamous Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen, known as the cleanup crew, they would follow the troops like into the Russian countries, right? And they would systematically murder the civilians, the very people in that land. And so you could make the argument, right, that fascism is inherently inimical to what we hold dear in modern Western civilization, And that hence, right, under the two categories of why you fight a war and how you fight it, that this was a just war, having fought it. Not to mention that they were trying to impose fascism, right, by force. And of course, the degree to which Japan was fascist, they didn't declare themselves fascist. It's not a complete nice fit. But they, of course, exuded many fascist institutions, practices, etc., that we'll get to soon. But it also, you could make the argument, right, that these fascist countries started the war, right? And that's another part of it, is that, preemptive strikes have always been morally dubious, right? Is it ever really fair or ethical to throw the first punch? But on the contrary, right, the fascist countries, they arguably threw the first punches in their imperialistic endeavors. So you see, right, like with Germany, and you probably are well aware of the common narrative that Germany had begun, arguably quite victimized by the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I. They had lost a good 10% of their population through their colonies and so forth, through the War Guilt Clause and Versailles' mandate that the losing Central Powers give up their empires. They also fashioned modern-day Poland and Czechoslovakia from the German Empire, and taking that obviously from them. So there were a couple areas, especially, right, to which Adolf Hitler and the German National Socialists took great exception. The strategic importance, supposedly, of the port of Danzig, now given to Poland, and of course the Sudetenland in the recently, established Czechoslovakian country. And so he was very adamant about that. They were not to engage in an annexation or Anschluss of Austria, and he did that defiantly. They were to keep a 100,000-man army, and he defied that. They were to pay reparations, and he defied that. Although there were economic, the inflation and everything that was going on, it perhaps was arguably, untenable of a situation, but he still was defiant in his tone and his decision that the reparations under the War Guilt Clause were no longer to be paid to Germany's enemies. And then, of course, the Rhineland, right, where France was afraid that there might be a third invasion, right, with the Franco-Prussian War, World War I. As of recent note, they didn't want a third occasion of that happening, and so they ordered the demilitarization of the Rhineland within Germany by the border, and they had international troops there. And Hitler basically played a game of chicken and raised an army and marched them into that area. And the international community blinked first, if you will, and they removed their international soldiers and allowed him to do such, right? But after such actions, he was given an ultimatum that he could do no more, and he'd even promised that he wouldn't. And then, of course, the beginning of September of 1939, he invaded Poland. And at that point, right, he didn't just invade Poland. I mean, it was in very quick succession. He hit Norway, wanting to get Swedish iron ore, use it as a launch pad into the Baltic area. We don't know for sure how early on he was already thinking about, secretly at least pondering the invasion of the Soviet Union, of Russia. Denmark, right, and Holland. He took those countries as well, all these Scandinavian countries. And then, of course, he'll go into Belgium and through the Ardennes forest into France and take France pretty quickly. So at any rate, clearly, right, he was, you can make the argument that Nazi Germany, fascist Germany, constituted the aggressor as well in World War II. Okay, and then let's see here. So that's number one, right? And then with number two, remember that what you're looking at is the Japanese. If number one revolves around court history style, we fought a just war against fascism, right, as a justifiable cause for fighting. Number two is trying to just basically deflect and say, well, look how awfully our Japanese enemies fought, right? The manner by which they fought. One of the primary source, it's not a primary source. I mean, just one of the main sources that I utilized on this one is called unjust enrichment. And I kid you not, if it can be trusted, it states that in many cases up to 40%, 40, right? Up to 40% of prisoners of war captured by the Japanese did not survive the war. And of course, right, long after and long before the Crimean War and the Geneva Accords, it was assumed under international law, right, that you are to trade prisoners of war. You're to give them food and water and shelter, right, and not to harm them. You are not to engage in non-compensated oriented work and put them to slave labor, etc. And the Japanese violated virtually every facet of that part of international law, right? And remember, of course, they many of their military leaders, along with going back to about 1905 with the Meiji Restoration, they embraced the old samurai Bushido code, right? Which was in some ways, like I said, that kind of that collectivist mentality, like fascism, where you as one person don't really matter, and your individuality is not relevant nor significant. It's what you do for Mother Japan, for the kingdom, and for the emperor as your leader, right? As your divine leader, who again knows what's best for the general will and is to be blindly obeyed and trusted, right? And that, of course, death before dishonor, that it was disgraceful in the culture, the institutional leadership culture of this time of Imperial Japan to surrender. You fight to the death, right? And we saw that during the island hopping campaign. My goodness, in Saipan, the mass suicides there, terrible Tarawa, little Peleliu, and then, of course, Iwo Jima. Right? In many of those cases, you have thousands of defenders on these relatively small rock islands in the Pacific Ocean, and they were fought almost to the man, to the death, where we virtually, garnered almost no prisoners of war after fighting them. And so, at any rate, that's going to play into the whole narrative of our justification for dropping the hydrogen and plutonium bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But we'll get to that. But at any rate, right, so you look into those types of facts with Imperial Japan and its army, and how awfully it treated non-combatants in particular, right, and how ruthlessly they fought, arguably, during World War II. Then when numbers 3 and 4, I do a 180 and organize revisionist history, right? And on number 3, right, you're looking for evidence of saying, well, did the U.S. really fight by the rules as well? Did we sometimes, hit below the belt and engage in, ethically and internationally, legally dubious behavior? And I'll get to that pretty soon, okay? But that's what you want to focus on with number 3. And then number 4, right, I'm tried to formulate the argument that were we even really fighting for the right reasons? We supposedly knew about the Holocaust and did little to nothing about it for most of the duration of the war. We were hypocritical with the Atlantic Charter in claiming the rights of humanity and of the individual, including his or her dignity and right to a certain standard of living and not to have to live in fear and to be integrated by his society and all that, right? But look how we were treating our African Americans, still keeping them segregated. When the black women came into the East Bay and to Oakland and Richmond to work in the munition factories, right, and the Kaiser shipyards, look how they were treated so awfully. There's a book called Abiding Courage. You could read about that. Look at the treatment of Mexican Americans with their Texas regiment's complaints at the Rapido River in Italy, supposedly kind of thrown in, they felt, like cannon fodder across this river on a semi-suicidal mission, and that their lives were seen to be very expendable by their superiors. and liberally thrown into danger's way. And then, of course, you look at the Zoot Suit riots, right, in Los Angeles. And that's going to be kind of an amalgamation of long-term tensions, economic competition, cultural and literal separation in East LA, marginalization, of course, going back to the Mexican-American War, etc., right, in the 1840s, and the tension that all kind of culminated into these Zoot Suit riots, if you want to look further into that. And so were we really fighting in the right spirit for the right reasons? Were we really living up to the Atlantic Charter as our reason for entrance into the war, or are we simply just viscerally and punitively reacting to Pearl Harbor, right, with the attack of Pearl Harbor? So at any rate, and then of course, which I could have put in 3 or 4. Maybe arguably I should have put it in 3 instead of 4, as far as why we were fighting, but then how we fought it. And that is Executive Order 9066, right? Where we put between 110 and 120,000 Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans, right? Remember, under the 14th Amendment, you're born or naturalized here, you're a citizen. So we're talking also Japanese American citizens. Into these internment camps, a couple dozen of them, the main ones, here in the western states. And, you even had, here in California, you even had a couple deaths, a couple violent deaths, a couple insurrections, if you will, of the young Japanese American men within these camps, refusals to fight for the United States Armed Forces, and those who did agree to fight with and for the United States Armed Forces when taking these questionnaires, if you will, within the internment camps, they often were still not trusted to fight in the Pacific beyond just linguistics and being able to just use their knowledge of the Japanese language, but instead, right, they were sent oftentimes to Italy, into the European theater to fight Nazi Germany instead. And of course, you might be aware of the famous 442nd Regiment, arguably the highest decorated regiment in American military history, comprised predominantly, or if not solely, I can't recall, of Japanese Americans, soldiers. So at any rate, right, so you have the alleged causes. German imperialism and quick success. When they came into Europe, like I said, what they'll become famous for, right? I'll actually even put this on here. I'm sure you're familiar with it. And that is Blitzkrieg, right? Lightning War. My German, I have no German. Let me see if I did the I, if it's I before E or E before I. It hasn't underlined it, so I'm going to go with that for now. But of course, right, with lightning warfare, it very rapid, oriented. You hit the weak spot in the enemy's line and you immediately exploit it. You break through and go a certain distance, and then you begin encirclement from that breaking point. You utilize, right, the relatively fast Panzer tanks. You utilize the Stuka bombers of the Luftwaffe, of their Air Force. You have motorized regiments that follow behind, literally on motorcycles, and then you have your sometimes your shock troops, your elite SS troops, and others coming behind. But just this was, you look at it now and you think, okay, that makes sense. There's nothing, that is apparently, excessively brilliant about that, but it just worked almost miraculously well early in the war, especially in France and in Poland, actually, right, for the German army. So their successes in early, in like May of 1940 were amazing. And so at any rate, let's see here. Remember also that we, what also helped, so notice what I'm doing is I not only gave, context and try to give direction to the 4 argumentative sections, but now I'm trying to give you kind of just basic narrative and context to the war itself as well. So argumentatively and also just in kind of narrative chronological, not so much chronological, but somewhat chronological fashion. All right. And remember also, junior college instructors are meant to be, basically familiar with most topics that they're there to cover. But there's certainly, I myself certainly am not an expert in any single one. All right. So I'm doing my best here with the basic narrative of the military, chronology of the war. So at any rate, they do very well, Nazi Germany, in 1940, in the spring and summer of 1940, right, and taking much of the Scandinavian countries, Central Europe, and then down into Western Europe. You might be familiar with the Dunkirk evacuation. Over 300,000 British soldiers survived to fight another day, were transported back to England to fight another day because they were being surrounded, and they would have been captured or killed, but primarily captured had they not escaped to fight in the future. And that's huge, right? Because with England falling, Russia at the time being an ally of Nazi Germany. Remember, they signed a non-aggression pact. And they even started splitting the spoils, if you will. That parts of Poland were to go to Russia in the east, and the rest of it to Germany from the west. Finland was to be given to the Soviet Union, and then Sweden and Norway next to it were to be given to Nazi Germany, and so forth. Right? We all know from hindsight that that's not going to stick, because one of the most iconic, images that you see oftentimes of World War II are pictures of Stalingrad, etc., of German soldiers fighting in the freezing weather of Russia, invading that country. So at any rate, what was really big, right, is certain themes that you find very often in World War II books one is just finite resources. The Germans, and especially the Japanese, we'll get more on to soon, they had a problem by the end of the war, literally running out of oil, for instance, and gas. Literally not able to replenish tanks and weaponry of any sort. Of course, their Air Force, their fighter jets, etc. They were unable to rebuild what would get destroyed on a battlefield. And of course, as a contrast to that, the United States, it was like the United States was just getting warm by the end of like 43. Where we were just really turning out tank and fighter jets, improving the technology thereof. Not so much of the tanks, but especially of the fighter jets, with some of our latter, the Hellcats, of course the P-38 and the P-51 Mustang. We're going to evolve and get better during the war and what we created. Our anti-tank artillery and guns greatly increased during the war, thus decreasing the efficacy, right, of the German tanks, and how deadly they were at the beginning of the war ceased to be by the end of the war, right? We caught on to their tactics, to the Blitzkrieg tactics and their technology, and had developed an answer for it. Instrumental in developing an answer for it would be British intelligence. The famous Enigma machine and their Ultra program, whereby they, at Bletchley Park and other places in England, they learned to decipher the codes, right, of not only of the Germans but of the Japanese as well. And I just can't even imagine. I tried to read a book or two on that topic, and so much of it went over my head. But just you have to consider the Morse code and other things, and then there were like 2 steps involved just to get it into their native language, right, of the German or the Japanese language. And then from there, what does each term that they used signify, right? Because everything was symbolic. And they would have to, I just can't even imagine the intelligence and the methods employed that were able to do so. But they cracked the codes. It was Operation Magic with the Japanese and Ultra with the Germans. So, I mean, you got the enemy's playbook. You know what he's going to do before he does it, right? by the middle of the war. And so then also radar was huge. Radar was big in deterring Germany from a land invasion of England itself, right? Because remember, England was the last man standing. France was down, right? Russia wasn't an ally yet. The United States wasn't involved in the war yet. So throughout, the end of 40 and most of 41, it was just the British fighting it out because, the Polish and others, the Balkans, as you see here, one by one became pro-Axis powers, right? And then, like you see here, a lot of this Eastern and Central Europe was lost and to the enemy. And so, at any rate, so the English, this was big. Sorry, not there yet. So English radar and the Ultra program, right? Like I said, production of lost commodities, population, right? The United States is going to have a big advantage over Nazi Germany. Not to mention, Nazi Germany is fighting so many different countries at once on her own, virtually, because it was kind of a jokingly contended that they had to carry Italy quite often. And then, of course, there was this kind of a gentleman's agreement that Japan would carve out its own Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, as they called it, in the Pacific, while the Nazi Germans took over Europe, right, in Eurasia. So at any rate, let's see here. So then... let's see here. Sorry. I'm trying to think of any other major themes. We'll just get to it. Let's see here. So there was invasion of Russia, right? And supposedly the Russian army split into three before coming to Moscow. And in hindsight, a lot of historians contend that was a poor decision. They mainly wanted to grab the oil of the Caucasus region, right? And so they sent a third into the Caucasus. They kept a third going into Moscow. Of course, the weather did not cooperate, and they experienced one of the coldest winters, recorded in modern Russian history in December. I want to say December of 42, perhaps. But at any rate, literally, like December 5th, in the midst of this great storm, the Russians engaged in a counterattack. And so the Russians, right, for one, they engaged in kind of like with Napoleon, scorched earth policy and this kind of compressed spring strategy, whereby they would deliberately just survive to fight another day and give false hope to the Nazi German armed forces, right, with their blitzkrieg tactics, and just retreating further eastwardly. But then they would burn a lot of their crops and sabotage a lot of their equipment, so that there would be a long, tenuous supply line without many local resources for the German army to contend with, right, to feed and clothe and arm and take care of and replenish their armed forces. So that's going to eventually not go well. Literally down to the oil and the machine guns used by Nazi Germany and their uniforms. They came with such arrogance that they didn't prepare for the cold weather. And so tanks at times froze in their tracks. Guns malfunctioned. People died of frostbite and hypothermia. It's crazy. Then also you have the fact that in his sense of perhaps fanaticism, his ego, his desperation, his paranoid personality, his kind of ruthless willingness to sacrifice people for the common good, is Joseph Stalin, began trying his best to arm his population, especially like places like Stalingrad, and encouraged guerrilla warfare, right? Like with this Spanish against Napoleon, guerrilla means little war, right? And so people that are unarmed, are trying to snipe at them and fight at them from the rubble the broken down buildings in Stalingrad, right? Fighting to the last man. The fact that, you had some brilliant commanders with the Soviets, not to mention their famous T-34 tank. So you look at Minsk, you look at, shame on me, there's another one that's more significant even than Minsk. As far as it was the largest tank battle. Of course, as soon as the video's over, I'm going to remember the name of it. But at any rate, the T-34 tanks were very effective in the snow and in the elements and against the Panzers, much more durable and powerful than their Panzer counterparts. Not to mention, as they began catching on to the Blitzkrieg tactics, so whereby they would almost kind of set them up, and the U.S. allies, U.S. and Canadian and French resistance and British allies are going to do the same after D-Day in France, right? Is they're going to literally try to set up the Blitzkrieg to be used against the Germans. They will deliberately create a vulnerable spot in the line, anticipate the German tanks and others to break through that area, and then immediately encircle them once they break through there, right? And so with the Russians, they did that successfully with the encirclement and pincer movements. They also used anti-tank and mining explosives very effectively and set traps for the Nazi tanks and other units as well. They also had sheer numbers, right? Russia's population is just ridiculously high, right? So they literally, for instance, in Manchuria, were supposedly keeping a 1 million-man army on reserve, just in case it had to be used against Japan, with Japan's, ambitions in that area. So they eventually sprung that 1 million-man army against the famous 6th Panzer Division and Nazi German divisions. And so the famous 6th Panzer Division, right, under von Paulus, they're going to shamefully, to the Nazi German party, they're going to surrender what was left of their men and resources at Stalingrad. And so it's going to be the beginning of the end, right? Arguably the failure of the conquest of the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany. And from there, they're going to begin to become encircled and pushed back westwardly. Remember that the Russians, however, incompletely, tried at least and partially succeeded in taking over Finland. So they had from Finland and Lithuania, right, and the Baltic states, as well as eventually from a couple of the Balkan states here at the bottom of Europe, both so on the northwest and the northeast, the northwest and the southwest of the Russian army, right? They're gonna spring armies against Russia behind her as they're pushing her westwardly from the east. And so, so it's all going to be the beginning of the end. And then let's see here, North Africa, they're mainly fighting to maintain their kingdoms, and that's the Allied powers especially too, right? The French had North Africa, right? Morocco and Tunisia, etc. And the British had South Africa, had Egypt, right? And they did not want to relinquish those areas. You also even had some involvement in the Middle East, especially with the British role in giving a somewhat of a refuge state to the Jewish community in Palestine at the end of World War I at Versailles. And so the Nazi Germans were trying to capitalize on that and getting the Muslim countries, especially in Iraq, to fight against the Allies. But in North Africa, right, a lot of it was about, as you see in this picture, the Mediterranean and the quote, soft underbelly of Europe. The Balkans, not just because Romania had such, oil, but because of their geopolitical location in light of a future invasion of Russia, were considered vital. The Mediterranean was considered vital, right, logistically, for troops, for food, for trade, for access to resources, and for protection of their periphery of their boundaries, right? and to hold on to what they had conquered. So in North Africa, Erwin Rommel is going to earn a name for himself, do very well. When the Americans first come in and fight there, you could look up Kasserine Pass. We did not do well, and we did not develop an initially, positive image as fighters and as armed a country of armed forces. Let's see here. You have Bernard Montgomery, and his aggressiveness, and also just the fact that Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, he was amazingly shrewd. He had great tactics, kind of hit and run, mobile tactics, but he only had so much of a beachhead to work with. It seemed like they kept taking the same few cities in North Africa and having a long supply line to the next one after that. And they would just simply oftentimes try to outflank one another or go through the weak spot and encircle one another. And finally, Bernard Montgomery took a more confrontational, larger scale battle to Rommel and his army. And Rommel had left for a while due to illness and came back, and he said that things were untenable. For a while, he literally, again, had run out of gas. And so they're going to kind of cut their losses, the Germans, that is, in North Africa. And but in Italy and in the Mediterranean itself, they're gonna hold very well for quite some time. So Malta, the island of Malta, and the island of Crete were held very successfully by Nazi Germany. When we did invade Sicily and the boot of mainland Italy, we, the United States and our allies, right? We Operation Torch. We're going to be held just outside of Rimini. What was the other one? Monte Cassino and Rome, right? And the Germans are going to hold what was called the Gothic Line for quite some time. And so, not to mention the geography of Italy made it tough. And things were further, made complex by the fall of Benito Mussolini. Literally falls from grace, is arrested, then captured and saved by Nazi Germany, put back in charge for a little while longer, and then another coup against him ends up taking his life. And so it was a pretty dramatic story, Italy in World War II. And like I said, you also have ties in Italy to claims from historians, right, that Americans of minority demographics, right, African American, Hispanic American, Asian American, that they fought well, they contributed well to in that area, and in some cases, right, contending that their lives were considered cheaply discarded and thrown on semi-suicidal errands, if you will. So then you have, let's see here, but El Alamein is a big victory, and getting up into Italy is going to help, right, with a soft underbelly. Eventually, the Balkans next to Italy are going to implode. We don't have time, and I don't remember all the details, but I mean, you have a guy named Tito in Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria switched sides a couple times. Greece was contested, and that England successfully defended the anti-fascist wing of Greece for a while. Then Germany will, and then Germany will kind of momentarily relinquish Greece for higher priorities, etc. So it was volatile in and of itself because of domestic and international diplomacy interchangeably happening. And then, of course, ultimately you have D-Day, right? The invasion of Normandy, France. And you see here, right, like if you've seen Saving Private Ryan, etc. So you have there the French coast. Rommel was called up, right? And the euphemism was Rommel's Garden or the Atlantic Wall. And for God knows how many miles, I had once known up the coast of Spain as well, and Portugal and France, up into Belgium. the Germans, ostensibly didn't know where and exactly when the Allies were going to hit that coast, right, with a mainland invasion. And of course, it's probably a poor analogy, but I think of an analogy of trying to engage in a physical contest with someone while you're floating in a swimming pool and that person is standing on the diving board or just standing on the concrete outside the pool. The degree to which you are at such a huge disadvantage in trying to extricate your body from that water, and all that person has to do is put a minimal amount of force and just simply pushing you back into the pool as you're trying to get up out of it, right? But once you get up and get your feet underneath you, then you've somewhat leveled the playing field, right? So likewise, we had to just get a foothold on the coastal Atlantic beach, right? And be able to bring in more and more men and supplies, etc., right? And so there was a lot of espionage, a lot of mind games, and a lot of preparation that this entailed, right? And so, Operation Overlord, it was initially intended to be June 4th. Because of weather, we didn't hit until the morning of June 6th of 1944. We had over like 400. It was just ridiculous how many thousands of ships of all levels, destroyers, battleships, carriers, LCTs, right, and the movable boats slash tanks, or boats that carried tanks and men that could come right up onto the shore and leave without the need of tide changing. So all kinds of aircraft and men, right, who were training largely in England, right, prior to this, to the invasion. That we had reason to believe that Hitler was anticipating the Pas de Calais, PASDE, and then CALAIS, I think is the spelling. Because it made sense. It was the narrowest point between the English Channel and the French coast. It made sense for evidently several reasons. And so we had Patton, literally, because he was so respected by supposedly the Nazi command, raise a phony army, fake intelligence, look up Operation Mincemeat, just crazy stuff, the extent to which we went supposedly to try to trick and confuse the Nazi leadership as to where we were going to hit, right? Well, of course, we ended up hitting the beaches of Normandy, and there were like 4 or 5 major beaches, but the one beach that very anomalously faced great opposition, right? Like just much more opposition than the other beaches, was Omaha, was codenamed Omaha Beach. And that happened to be a beach where it was not primarily Canadian or English soldiers, but American soldiers, right? So we caught up with our lack of experience in the war very quickly with the invasion of Omaha. You could look up the 82nd and the 101st Airborne, and how hours before this, the night before, and some even earlier than that, were dropped via parachutes from the planes, right, to get behind the forces, try to sabotage things. For one, right, key bridges from which the Nazi German command could send reinforcements to the beaches of Normandy to help repel us back into the water. They were to take over and blow those bridges up. They were to jam radio communications, right? And try to block the way with certain roads. They found out early that there were a few cities that were very vital, that would become very vital, in either getting from inland France to the coast, or the opposite, right? For the Allies to make it to the coast and then work their way inland into France, right? To take on the Nazi occupiers. So some of those towns or cities that will become famous, semi-famous from this fight would be like Caen. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. It's Caen, and I certainly don't know French, but I've heard it pronunciated that way on documentaries. Cherbourg, right? St. Lô. Those are a few of the big ones, right? And so at any rate, our men were helped and abetted by the weather. Hitler was anticipating us on the 5th. And, some historians omit it. Some that seem to be relatively respectable have actually included it. So that I want to qualify this in saying that this is possibly still true. What some historians contest, that Hitler took a sleeping pill the night of the 5th, had stayed up all night from the 4th to the 5th, and had a bad headache and took a sleeping aid and did not want to be bothered, and supposedly was not told about the D-Day invasion, and that it likely was not going to be followed as kind of a feint or fake, kind of jab so you can give him with a straight right, that it was not just a mere jab for a real punch to pot of Calais, but it was the real thing. Supposedly he did not really entertain that and communicate with his subordinates about it until about noon of the day of D-Day. And of course they hit at like 6:30, 6 in the morning. And so that gave us very vital hours to take these beaches, right, and to gain a beachhead. The quality of the soldiers, some would say, right, that, by this time of 44, a lot of them were ex-Hitler youth who had grown up, older men who were semi-retired and conscripted once the German army became more desperate and had lower expectations. You also, some people contend that if Rommel had just had the permission and his autocratic, military structure to move divisions as he pleased, that he likely could have repelled us. And of course, you do have a quote from Rommel, and this is a loose paraphrase, okay, because I don't have it readily available. I don't remember which book, but he basically said, right, oh man, the Allies have taken the beaches of Normandy, and he said, he kind of halfway boasted and complained. If they put me in charge, the Allies, that is, right, at this point, he said, I'd clean this war up within a month. So to a lot of the British, right, there was a sense of foreboding that this was now certainly the beginning of the end, if that had not already happened in Russia. And so we're going to fight on. At that time, our Third Army under Patton is going to gain a lot of fame and notoriety, right? And again, trying to counter and anticipate and set up the German and even imitate the German blitzkrieg moves. So often, so much of the battles, still, even with the technology that we had devised with floatable bridges, etc., right, revolved around rivers. So a lot of times, right, like the Mu, the Seine, the Loire, the Low, of course, the Rhine River, the Danube, and others coming from the east as well, the Vistula, became big points to which the major battles that determined the course of the war happened. Okay, at this point. So let's see here. And then ultimately we're going to engage in bombing of Japan, of Germany itself, right? And remember the manner by which we fought. We're going to utilize bombs. We're going to have a system, right? Supposedly with Winston Churchill, whereby if you were engaging in war munition factories, right? That's worth, let's say, 5 points. If you have telecommunications that's used by the military, that's worth, let's say, 3 points. They had a point system, and if you gained a finite amount of points, it was determined, right, that your city had become a military target, right? That it was vital militarily and strategically to bomb facilities, buildings, industries, right? To help hamper the war production process, right? Telecommunications process, transportation process of the enemy. And of course, we had people complaining, right, saying, why aren't we hitting the railroads that are leading to the concentration camps? Which is a very valid question, why we didn't do that sooner. So at any rate, right, but when you look at places like in the Balkans, right, and eventually by the end of the war, it seems like it devolved, or it went downhill into where they became a little bit more, brutally honest and ethically ambiguous, where they began talking about the morale, where it's vital to hit a certain city to simply lower the morale for the war, to encourage the people to get fed up with the suffering so that they might rise against their own government and refuse to fight as soldiers, etc., right? Now, like I said, you're really getting into the ends justifying the means type of ethics when you start doing that. The euphemism oftentimes used was carpet bombing, hitting cities where even if you hit a factory, right? Imagine them doing that to us in Oakland and Richmond, hitting a factory and saying, hey, they're manufacturing, right? They're riveting P-51 Mustangs. They're in Richmond. So we need to blow up the facilities. Well, what about, the close to 9,000 employees, African-American women just trying to earn a living, who moved into that area and are working in those shipyards, etc., right? They're not combatants. So we began doing that, right? Then in the Pacific Theater, I mean, look at this, right? So Japan, right? I mean, this played out like a Rocky movie. How quickly and dramatically and somewhat thoroughly the Japanese defeated the United States and the British and her allies in Asia and in the Pacific early on, and how things finally change in 42, and then there's a turnaround, and then the underdogs, if you would call us that. Of course, the Japanese would not, because they contended in their Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere rhetoric and plans that they were trying to liberate Asia for the Asians themselves, right? That they were coming as liberators, as fellow Asians, and not Anglo or quote Caucasian Europeans. So at any rate, they were angry about the 3-to-5 ratio in the early 1920s when we had international meetings, and we dictated that Japan had to have a smaller armed forces than the other powers that she had been allied to. Certain territory that she had won fair and square before and after World War One, the Sino-Japanese, not the Sino-Japanese, I'm sorry, the Russo-Japanese War, right? International bodies of Europeans determined to take those lands back from Japan. They showed umbrage to how we were treating Japanese students in California segregated public schools. I kid you not. Teddy Roosevelt dealt with that. And so there were definitely things that Japan felt umbrage toward and felt like she had a rightful chip on her shoulder against the West. So remember with the Meiji Restoration, there was a notion that kind of means and ends, right? We're differentiated. That we're gonna enhance our sense of nationalism and patriotism, right? Almost to the point of xenophobia, of fearful, almost hatred toward all outsiders. We're Japanese, we identify that as that, we're proud of that, right? But the way by which we were going to become successful is by emulating the West. We don't want to join the West, we don't want to become one of them, but we realize that we need to imitate their methods, right? And their institutions to succeed and become progressive. So they, believe it or not, they tried to emulate at one time America's educational system, Germany's military, England's medical system, etc., right? Trying to get from the best of each Western power. And when they fought initially, the Japanese Zero did very well compared to our fighter jets. The Japanese carriers, which have become so vital, right? Because look how vast the Pacific Ocean is. So they would have to put the planes on carriers, right? These vast carriers who could oftentimes hold up to 100 to over 300 jet planes on them, have them parked on them, and then go across the Pacific, and then they could engage in flight from those carriers. So the carriers were huge, and they were very comparable, if not even better initially than Americans. The battleships were probably arguably better than Americans. So you remember Pearl Harbor, right? The battleships went back to the 1883 Naval Appropriations Act with the USS Iowa, the most famous prototype, right? So these had become kind of archaic by this time, early in World War II. And so, just extent after extent, the Japanese formed a very formidable army. They were very risk-oriented in their in their tactics, right, and their strategies. Oftentimes they would make very bold moves. One example, right, is not only like blitzkrieg, would they try to hit weak spots and try to utilize speed, right, but in some cases they would take on situations in which they knew they were greatly outnumbered and still try to take people by surprise. So they were very bold in some of their tactics early on in the war. An embarrassment, right, to the Allied powers. If you wanted to look into that, look up the fall of Singapore, right? People jokingly said that the Japanese came as an army on bicycles, outnumbered 3-1, and got the frightened English leader to surrender Singapore, right, and much of Malaya on a given afternoon, and that he literally lost respect for the English, right, and the Allied powers when he came in and saw how well ensconced their equipment and their soldiers, and how high a number their availability of soldiers was. They couldn't believe that they had surrendered so shamefully. So you can look that up with Singapore, right? Burma was highly contested. They wanted to make a Burmese road through modern Myanmar. A lot of drama there. Dutch Indonesia, Borneo, with all the oil there, and the treatment of the Dutch as far as prisoners of war and some of their combatants or non-combatants. Kind of dramatic story there. The Philippines, the sad story of the comfort women, how they would systematically rape Filipino girls and women, and how they treated the Filipinos and so forth. Just a lot of dramatic cases here. But look, I mean, they're going to basically make it all the way to Port Moresby coast of Darwin and Port Moresby of Australia. They're going to take all of the major island chains and archipelagos of Asian Pacific, right? It's amazing how successful and quickly successful at that the Japanese were. Again, when you look technically, they maintained a parliament with the prime minister. They technically shared power with the cabinet and with the military establishment, and of course all under Emperor Hirohito. But in practice, right, it seemed as if there were times where it was made very clear that the military was running the show. So, for instance, when you got a backlash from the prime minister himself, at one time it was Prince Konoye, who had some qualms about how the Japanese army was treating the Chinese after the Mukden incident and after Manchuria had become Manchukuo. They look up the rape of Nanking. It was awful how the Japanese were treating Chinese civilians and how many they killed. And so, you got some backlash in their civilian parliament, even their prime minister. And there were joint assassinations, I believe, in 1936 against them. And then you had prime ministers abdicate their power. People in parliament suddenly shut up and stop fighting against this new generation of military commanders. And so, at any rate, Hideki Tojo, however unfair or fair it might be, I know not the subject in depth enough to make an educated conclusion about that question. But Hideki Tojo is oftentimes, his face becomes emblematic with the idea that Japan's government was now run by the military, which itself had become very kind of autocratically throwing its weight around, very imperialistic and coveting other countries and lands, right? And very Bushido oriented, right? Somewhat even ruthless oriented in subjecting individualism, freedom, dissent, and dialogue and open debate, subjecting all that to the supremacy of unity and the glory of Imperial Japan, right? So hence it's likened to a fascist country. So, we issued the moral embargo. Japan was almost always greatly dependent upon, they call it non-ferrous metals, oil, even rice and food. They couldn't feed all their people, at this time. And so, the Japanese main islands are only so big, and their population was incredible. And so, at this time, they contended that it was militarily, kind of like the Lebensraum rhetoric of Germany, that it was necessary for their people to gain living space and gain resources from outside the Japanese main islands. And so when we gave our moral embargo because of the treatment of Chinese civilians at Nanking, etc., right? And then Halsey demanded that to the diplomats of Japan that they surrender the lands that they had already taken, which I believed even included Manchuria, all the way back to 31. And of course, that was not going to fly with the Japanese command. And so hence it was seen as if, some revisionist historians would contend that we partially pushed Japan into war, or at the very least, we should have easily been able to foresee that Japan was going to attack us, right? And then when you put that together with our code deciphering process and program, you still have to this day certain, conspiracy theorists, right? There was a woman, I want to say Dorothy Edgers, under a guy named Alwyn Kramer, who received some highly alarming codes from the Japanese command that of course were not direct in saying we're going to attack Pearl Harbor. Nothing is that clear for sure. But what she interpreted to mean just that they were going to hit our main naval yards and concentrated naval forces in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, right? And Oahu. And so at any rate, Kramer and his office, they acted supposedly, kind of, blasé and arrogant about these. Also, just at the last minute, President FDR, they were decoding this stuff in Honolulu itself. And he ordered them to just send the messages to Washington, D.C. and let his experts do it instead. There were still codes and warnings given out, but they were mainly given to one and not the other. I can't remember which one was which, but you had Walter Short with the Army and Husband Kimmel with the Navy. One of them received impressively much more information and warning than the other did, right? And so, to what extent were we just kind of caught unaware, arrogantly, unaware of what was to come? To what extent could it have been a conspiracy? I just throw that out there, okay? But be skeptical about conspiracies. I want to qualify that, okay? So I'm certainly not saying I adhere to that, but I do think that there's enough to it that it's worthy of discourse. It's worthy of talking about. All right, because FDR wanted to galvanize American public sentiment for war against the Axis powers, and he felt like he did not sufficiently have it prior to Pearl Harbor being bombed. So I just throw that out there, and I'm going to move on, okay? But after the Japanese attack, right, it was very lucky or convenient that our carriers were not there, which would be of such vital importance during the war. Out in the vast Pacific Ocean, but a lot of them that were sunk, right, were somewhat obsolete battleships. But of course, it did galvanize public opinion. It did lead to, racist propaganda against the sneaky Japs during the war. Some people even tie that right to the use of the nuclear bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so, at any rate, that's something to think about. Finally, at the Battle of Coral Sea off of Port Moresby, Australia, and at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, we stopped the Japanese offensive, and never again would they expand like that. And so it was kind of the somewhat, beginning of a turning point. And then, of course, 5 minutes from 10:25 a.m. to 10:30 a.m., we had a contingent of men, a sortie of men of about 37 fighter pilots or jets, that literally got lost from the rest of our guys, and just their timing was amazing. The Japanese, we knew through the codes of magic that they were planning on hitting Midway Island, and we tried to prepare accordingly, right? And we tried to hide a fleet of about 4 carriers, right? And of course, the Japanese had 4 carriers as well. So we tried to hide that fleet, let them come and attack the island, and then hit them at the opportune time, right? And it didn't work out the way we had planned it. They engaged in 2 sorties, and we were planning for them just to engage in 1 on the island itself, and did some respectable damage. But also, they kept Japanese Zeros between 12 and 1,600 feet above sea level over their carriers as protectors, and they were deadly over our slow, cumbersome bombers. And so they shot down a lot of men flying off the carriers like the Hornet and the Enterprise, etc. And so, but our guys that got lost from the Enterprise, right, about 37 jets, they found themselves back right at 10:25, just after our second attempt at bombing their 4 carriers, right, had failed miserably. And in that moment, in those 5 minutes, those who were 1,200 feet above sea level came down to search for our, I don't know if it was our jets or our carriers or both, but they momentarily left their protective position. And then literally those who had gone on 2 attacks, right, on Midway Island, and or who had fought our fighter pilots in dogfights in the air, they were both, either or both, getting refueled, right, with I guess tons of fuel hoses all over the decks of these 4 carriers, or they were having their bombs switched from fragmentation bombs, which were used on land against Midway Island, right, to torpedo missiles, right, which could be used against carriers and battleships and destroyers and boats. So they were literally in those 5 minutes refueling and trying to switch their bombs from land-oriented attack missiles or bombs to water-oriented ones, right? And in those 5 minutes, those 37 guys found themselves over the carriers and dive bombed them, and then sunk in those 5 minutes. Sunk 3 of the 4 carriers. By 5 p.m. later that day, they had sunk the 4th one. And Japan just did not have, logistically, resource-wise, the ability to recreate these carriers. So this was huge. It literally hampered Japan's ability and her strategy, for that matter, and having to pick and choose where she could fight and where she could extend her naval resources and where she couldn't, right? After Midway. So Midway was a huge turning point, okay, in 42. And then we engaged in the island hopping campaign, right? And from what I understand, it's superficial level, okay, and I apologize. But for one, right, just simplistically, like the name implies, is we're trying to find the shortest, quickest routes, right, to mainland Japanese islands, to be able to have enough gas, and oil in the jets to fly above the Japanese islands. And ultimately, of course, for quite some time, it was on the books of consideration to engage in actual amphibious landings, like D-Day, right, of actual foot soldiers, infantrymen, onto the 5 main Japanese islands. So in order to do that, right, we wanted to find areas, and it was kind of a combination because, in some points, in some islands, we knew supposedly right what we were getting into, that it was going to be a major fight, that there were thousands of Japanese soldiers stationed on that given island, and there would be great resistance. But we chose, nevertheless, right, that island's strategic location was so vital it had to be taken. And then in other cases, we would look among the Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, right, these island chains, and say, well, you know what? I don't think the fight is worth it on this little island. Let's go ahead and skip a couple islands and go about 3 islands further down and hit that one instead. And so hence hit the area of least resistance. So to me, it was a curious combination, right? That where it was considered vital, it was considered vital. And we sacrificed the resources and men to do so. And where it could be avoided, it was arguably avoided. One of the possible exceptions and historical discourse are the Philippines. How vital strategically, right? Geostrategically, geopolitically, how important or necessary were the Philippine Islands? It's contested to this day, because some people believe, especially in light of like late Gulf and some of the fighting that happened on these on two of their islands, and all the men that were lost. Some make the argument that it was more about the ego of Douglas MacArthur than it was about vital necessity. So I'm just throwing that out there. So like with the Solomons and the Gilberts, you have Guadalcanal, you have Tarawa, right? With one of the other island chains, it's not on there written, but again, Peleliu. So some of these like Tarawa and Peleliu, right? I look up a book here, Retribution by Max Hastings, and he gives the stats of how many thousands of people were on an island that was like 7 miles long and like 1.5 miles wide. This tiny island, and the Japanese put thousands of soldiers on that island, and they virtually take no prisoners of war. So they had to virtually kill all of them, or those that didn't commit ritual suicide at the end, right? And so when they look at places like Tarawa, Peleliu, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and they look and they do the stats on the size of the island, right? And how many men were lost, how many rounds of ammunition were employed, and they would get these numbers, right, to suggest that every square inch of these islands cost a lot, for lack of a better adjective, in men and materiel, right? And I think you know where I'm going with this, is they use this argument in saying, just imagine with amphibious landings on 5 Japanese main islands, how much it's going to cost us, right? In the midst of this fanaticism of Japanese culture, etc., right? Of death before dishonor. So at any rate, that's what Truman's administration is going to argue in contending that it was necessary to drop the hydrogen and plutonium bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? But what is also interesting about that, right, is that Hiroshima did not make a spot on that point system. Remember, do they have war munitions? Do they engage in telecommunications? What exactly vital to the war effort exists there? Matter of fact, in many ways, Hiroshima was pristine, almost untouched by the war, at least architecturally and physically and economically, right? So some people make the argument that we hit Hiroshima for that very reason. So the Japanese couldn't say, oh, that was already devastated from the war. We wanted them to see, arguably, just how deadly this new weapon was by hitting a very pristine city that had virtually been untouched prior to that. And yikes, right, as far as the ethics of that, to whatever extent that is true. When you look at books on Oppenheimer, Niels Bohr, some of the main physicists and others, right, behind, and by the way, Niels Bohr was limited. He was very non-committal because he had ethical problems with utilizing scientific scientific knowledge to take human lives, right? And matter of fact, enough of the scientists are going to come up with those moral qualms and not wanting to just give their research over to the military to do as it pleased, that they literally wrote a famous petition there at Los Alamos in New Mexico. But at any rate, a lot of them were related to, in some way, persecuted Nazi Europe. It's amazing how many of them were tied in one way to a country or even to the Jewish community, taken over by Nazi Europe. So some of them, right, at Los Alamos, they utilized that logic in their ethics and saying, well, what we're doing is a lesser evil, that if we don't do this, Hitler scientists are going to beat us to the punch, and that would be even worse for humanity. So better us devise it here, right, against fascism, than the fascists come up with it first and utilize it first. Also, the civilian government was making overtures of peace because the signs were there that Japan's war was over by the end of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, right, coming in the periphery of the main islands. They had run out and couldn't replenish their resources, etc. And so you also had a big naval figure who said that we could use a cordon or a blockade and starve the Japanese islands into submission. That hence there were alternatives, that it may have been a false dilemma that Truman's administration was giving, that we either had to sacrifice 1 million men on these amphibious landings onto the mainland islands of Japan, right? Or use these awful bombs to psychologically frighten them and get them to capitulate, right? And so I find it a fascinating topic that's still discussed today, obviously. But after about 3 days after Nagasaki's bomb, Japan surrendered, right? So at any rate, this is a very long time. I apologize, but I hope you somewhat enjoyed some of it, learned something from it, and whatever extent anything that I have said differs from someone with a PhD in that particular topic, defer to him or her and not me. All right, I did my best. All right, have a good day. If I could turn this off somehow, have a good day.